All right, so we are here live for another edition of Your Genetic Type, and we are going to be talking about iron overload. And here is Dr. John Thomas. How you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm good. Haven't seen you in a little bit.
I know we've both been busy, I guess.
Yeah, both busy. So today we're going to be talking about understanding iron deficiency and iron overload. I think an often misunderstood concept in terms of both under iron and over iron, and how that relates specifically with MTHFR, or how that relates to the genetic component. And as we like to talk about, there are specific genetic types. So I guess where's the best place to start with this, John?
Well, I think maybe just at the beginning from this standpoint, because what happens a lot of times is someone goes in for their physical, or they go see their primary because maybe they're having fatigue issues or something along those lines, and they check iron levels, or they look at red blood cell counts and a CBC marker, or they check a ferritin level by itself, and those markers are abnormal, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, you're anemic, or you have low iron, and then they give them a script for iron, or they tell them, hey, you need to start supplementing with iron. I think that in itself is an injustice, because you got to take a step back and ask why. Okay, why is that marker low in the first place? And when we're kind of talking about iron, and just keep it as simple as possible for this conversation today, there's really kind of three stories that we're looking at from an iron side of things, and how this genetic stuff ties in. Okay, so from an iron side of things, we get it from food sources or supplemental sources, whatever we get into the system, goes through the guts. Then from the gut gets absorbed into the bloodstream, and then from the bloodstream it gets into the cell. All right, so we've got three spots: the gut, the bloodstream, and inside our cell. And so to keep it as simplistic as possible. So when you have blood work done and you're measuring, just say, your serum iron levels, and let's say it's low, well, does that mean that, hey, there's not enough iron in the blood? Well, that's what it does mean, but that doesn't tell you about how much is inside the cell. It doesn't tell you about if there's issues where you can't get it from the gut into the bloodstream in the first place. And so I know a lot of people maybe have taken iron supplements or an iron prescription, and actually makes their digestion feel worse. That could be a telltale that, hey, there's maybe transport issues where you can't just get the iron from the gut to the bloodstream, which is going to cause your blood levels to reflect low. But it's not an issue where you just have low iron. It's more of a transport issue or an absorption issue from gut into the bloodstream. And there are specific genetic factors that play into this, that people have mutations or SNPs in these genes that deal with transport from iron from the gut to the bloodstream, and from iron from outside the cell to inside the cell. And that could be where the problem lies, in why maybe they have an anemia or have a history of chronic anemia going forward. And so I think one of my biggest pet peeves is, hey, somebody go and get blood work done, they're told they're anemic, and automatically they're just put on iron. It's kind of like just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. It's really not, taking a step back and kind of asking why, or looking at 30,000 foot view and kind of look at the whole cascade of all the steps along the way of what can go wrong, of why somebody's got low iron levels or excess iron levels in itself. And iron is one of those essential, elements that is so vital. It's needed for, obviously, oxygen delivery to all our cells. It's needed for neurotransmitters. It's needed in our Krebs cycle for energy production. So if somebody's got issues with iron, there's a lot of things that can go wrong in the body, but the answer is not always just supplement with iron. The more I learn about this genetic component, the more I'm really taking a step back, and it's like, hey, if you've got adequate iron in the diet, there really should not be a need to supplement with iron going forward, if you know your genetic type and how those genetic components play into that.
Yeah, and a lot of the things that you talk about, having adequate in diet of iron is almost ubiquitous with overload in the diet, just from how things are fortified with iron enrichment that they mandated so long ago. But the other thing that really makes it more confounding or problematic is when you do it reductionistically, in terms of assessing your iron from the lab ranges and seeing that it's low or seeing that it's high from the lab ranges, and those lab ranges are so friggin' broad too. So maybe talk about that, because a lot of people will not know it, like if they're iron, if they're actually aren't iron deficient, because it shows that it's low, but really it's a processing problem in the body from getting it, absorbed into the gut, into the blood, into the cell, to actually having a problem with either overload or it is iron deficient. So what do we make of the labs, and what would be your suggestion on that?
Yeah, and like you mentioned, lab ranges are so broad, because they're trying to, diagnose pathology, to give somebody a diagnosis, and then try to be able to kind of push in a medication aspect from that standpoint. So when we talk about, what we learn from a functional perspective, are optimal ranges. So for a normal, healthy individual, what should a specific blood marker be? And so, this has kind of evolved for me too over the years, where, from a functional standpoint, where we're kind of taught, hey, there's optimal levels, but now understand the genetic component. My thought process kind of scaled back a little bit. And so when I look at iron levels, like serum iron levels, I usually like, somewhere between 70 and 90, 70 to 100. If it gets below 70, really 75, but it's below 70, I consider that abnormal. If it gets over 100, I consider that abnormal. And then we're talking about ferritin levels, which is kind of the iron storage aspect. I like those between 60 and 80. And it used to be one of those things where it's like, hey, we want to get that over 100, but not too much, because then you're overdoing it. I think if, we know that ferritin is, an acute phase reactant, the body will start storing iron in stress, if there's an infection or some type of stressor there. So ferritin excess is something, ferritin levels starting to get above 80 to 100 and above that, typically is your body's way of telling you that, hey, something's not turning in the right direction. So from a genetic perspective, when we know that if somebody has genetic mutations in some of these genes that deal with iron regulation, and you address that, you really kind of see those iron levels really fall into that sweet spot and maintain that sweet spot. And then with that, function and symptoms really, really, really become more manageable and under control, which is really, really great. There's other facets of this iron. You talk about iron-rich foods and that iron excess component, and that ferritin level can get really in excess into a hemochromatosis aspect. Probably won't touch much on that in this talk today. That's more of a pathology component, but we're really talking about people that have mood issues or energy aspects, things of that nature, where iron really needs to be in that sweet spot. And genetically, there's a handful of genes that are big players in this that people have no idea that could be a factor. And then their approach needs to be completely different. And the approach is not simply just taking iron, or if their iron's a little bit high, hey, go donate blood and you're good to go. No, you need to understand your genetic type, these genetic factors deal with iron transports. And if you understand how to address that, then if there's adequate iron in the diet and you're not overdoing it with a bunch of iron enriched foods, then your body's going to thank you, and it's really going to regulate iron, and really balance the iron, transporter iron load through the body at a much, much more delicate rate.
Yeah. So, okay. So starting from like your simplistic point of view, which you talked about, we have more than just looking at a lab range and saying, okay, I'm lower than the range, I'm higher than the range, or I'm in the range and I don't have to worry. We're looking at potentially how is it presenting with fatigue and GI disturbances and neurologic disorders. I mean, at the end of the day, mitochondrial health depends on iron, and oxygenation transportation depends on iron. So those are all things that we could have major fatigue with. So let's say we look at our blood work, we see our serum iron at 70 to 90. Then you're looking at your ferritin levels and assessing from there. But where now does the genetic component come in, John? Because I don't think this is one of those charters or one of those destinations where the savvy person that likes to do the work on their own can do on their own, because there are so many variables. So I guess the question is, where does the genetic component come in now that we've talked about assessing everything that we've talked about so far?
Yeah, so I think what we can do is we can kind of scale it back and try and keep it as simplistic as possible, and talk about this in terms of somebody that, let's just say, has low iron levels, okay? Rather than kind of like all the variables that go into it. Let's just say somebody goes to their doctor and let's say that their, hemoglobin levels are low, or their serum iron levels are low, or their ferritin levels are low, like, in the 20s or whatever, and they're told that, hey, your iron's low, you're anemic, you need to take iron. Because more often than not, that is a scenario that most people are going to fall into, okay? So we're going to take it from there and say, all right, somebody goes to get their physical done. They go in because they have fatigue issues, headaches, whatever it may be, mood issues, and they have low iron levels. And here, take iron, and you should be on your way, and everything should be fixed. Okay, we got to take a step back, and we got to look at it from this standpoint, because if your iron levels are low, we talked about three aspects: iron in the gut, iron in the bloodstream, iron inside the cell. If your iron levels are low, there's a likelihood that, all right, not only are you low in the serum, but you're probably low in the cell as well. Now, the big question to that is what's going on in the gut, okay? Because there is a transporter protein called ferroportin. And ferroportin, what it does is it transports iron from the gut into the bloodstream. And a lot of people with these low iron presentations that maybe are ongoing, maybe got a family history of low iron issues, that all the time, these ferroportin, okay, or these transport genes are genetically altered. So right out of the gate, that person has a slowed or reduced ability to take iron from the food they're eating and get it from the gut into the bloodstream, okay? And if they have a problem doing that, guess what their blood work is going to reflect like? It's going to reflect low. And that in itself is a problem. So if you just take more iron, all you're doing is you're putting more iron in the gut that can't get from the gut to the bloodstream in the first place, okay? Now, the second thing about the iron in the gut aspect is, a lot of these people that have some of these, low anemia or anemia presentation, low iron presentation of blood work, they also have a lot of digestive complaints as well. And we know that buildup of iron in the gut also does things like feed biofilms, and biofilms is kind of like the sludge layer where, bacteria and parasites, can really kind of harbor. It's like a force field that those things kind of get encapsulated in. That iron just makes that sludge layer thicker and thicker and thicker to protect those from the immune system. And so that's, where iron excess or our iron transport issues from the gut to the bloodstream can be a big, big problem, because you're really not accomplishing anything you're trying to set out to do by getting your iron levels up, because all you're doing is increasing the amount of iron in the gut that can't get from the gut to the bloodstream, and then you're feeding biofilms, which is making your digestion worse and changing the whole train of the gut. So we're talking about kind of the typical presentation with this. It's more about those people with low iron and taking that 30,000 foot view and taking a step back and saying, all right, I've got these other variables besides just, hey, I'm anemic. How do those play into that? And the biggest one that I see is that ferroportin component. And that can be such a game changer with people once they understand that, hey, there's an issue with transporting iron from the gut to the bloodstream. There's certain enzymes or certain herbal things you can do to help make that transport more efficient. And then what happens is all the iron that you're getting in the diet from food sources now can transport more effectively from the gut to the bloodstream without having to take excess iron in supplemental form or prescription form. That's just going to destroy the gut more.
Yeah, I mean, that's an awesome, recap, John, for people that may start to understand when I take iron. You mentioned there's some GI disturbances, but they sort of feel it as constipation. They're not really looking at the fact that it may not be getting into the bloodstream from the GI tract. But then there's that whole problem, which we talk about with genetic types, that there's these types of presentations that are priority systems on a pyramid that talk about where you gravitate towards, where you may have a low energy, or you may not have good immune health, or you may be toxically overloaded, or you may have stimulation issues, being understimulated, or hormone imbalances. So now take us to what happens when all of that iron is hanging around doing nothing and creating a wall. What happens from that in terms of that, that pyramid?
And the thing is that's the biggest player in this, because what happens is people don't realize that if they have anemia issues, all right, and it falls into transport components, and it's not a true case where basically they're just anemic. Maybe they're vegan-based diet and there's no iron, not enough iron in the diet, and they're just basically, there are cases where there's not enough iron in the mix. That is far and few between. But you mentioned what happens with that iron that's not being utilized. And that is something that is so inflammatory to the body. So if we got this excess iron in the gut that can't transport, if we got, iron in the bloodstream that can't get into the cell, okay, let's say somebody's serum iron is a little bit higher. Let's say it's over 100, 120. It's knocked on the door of the cell, but it can't get in. That is a huge, huge inflammatory stressor to the body, because if you've got excess iron or any iron in itself that is hanging around that can't get from one place to the other, that iron is going to go towards this flashing neon sign, which is hydrogen peroxide. And those two things are going to really kind of get attracted and start binding together, which is something we call a Fenton reaction. And that is going to drive some pretty nasty inflammation in the body. Okay, it's going to deplete your glutathione levels. It's going to just drive inflammation aspects, and that in itself is the bigger piece of this, where if we talk about if somebody's got iron issues, my biggest thing, first and foremost, especially if somebody's sitting in front of me or I'm chatting with them and they've got a lot of chronic issues, is, all right, yes, you're anemic, and we've got to figure out why you're anemic, why your blood levels look this way, why can't we transport iron? Yes, there's genetic factors, but the bigger factor in that is if somebody has that process going on, they most likely are driving inflammation with that iron that's not being utilized. And more often than not, these people have a lot of chronic issues. The needle can't budge the right direction. They're told it's a thyroid issue. They're told it's an adrenal issue. They're told it's some mitochondrial issue. It's leaky gut issues. It's just a kind of diagnosis after diagnosis. But the thing is it could be a mineral or element transport component that is just fueling massive inflammation day in, day out. And until they can control that, they're not going to really get the needle going in the right direction. And so that is something that when we see iron issues or iron transport issues where somebody's blood work reflects that the iron levels are not optimal, we know there's an inflammation process going on most likely. And then you take it back to the genetic aspect and you say, okay, are there these transport issues from gut to bloodstream or from bloodstream to cell? But then you also take it a step further into some of the other genetic types that we've classified in terms of the autoimmune type or the toxic accumulator type, where that iron is something that can be a catalyst or really kind of put lighter fluid on that fire of an inflammation process that's already going on.
Yeah, and I couldn't imagine, John, not having someone's genetic report in front of us to look at that whole pyramid at the bottom there where we put the priorities on in terms of, the priorities that we've put together in terms of, okay, how do we deal with this oxidative stress or this extra iron that's turning into free radicals that's ultimately causing our main problems. Like our main problems are maybe anxiety, or I can't sleep, or I'm overstimulated, or I'm understimulated, I'm depressed, my hormones aren't balanced, I can't conceive, I potentially have problems with building muscle or losing weight, because there's that whole connection there. So as far as what other things do we look at, I guess, in terms of some of those genetics that may, the consequence of how that may impact someone's neurotransmitters? What's the connection there, or how it may impact? I guess that's probably the best question there. How would someone having iron problems impact their neurotransmitter problems?
So when you talk about how you make a neurotransmitter, so let's talk about dopamine or serotonin. You make those neurotransmitters from amino acids. Okay, so dopamine, serotonin components. You're talking about things like tryptophan, tyrosine. Those amino acids are precursors to make those neurochemicals. And to take that amino acid to make the next step in the process to be able to make those brain chemicals, you need adequate iron. And if there's iron that is not being utilized properly, and that excess iron is, like you said, driving free radicals, it's binding to hydrogen peroxide, it's creating massive inflammation, then guess what? There's not enough iron that's being utilized or being transported properly to be able to make adequate neurotransmitters in the first place. And that's where sometimes we talk about, the symptoms of somebody that has low iron or excess iron components, there's often a neurological component to that. There's fatigue components to that. There's, ATP or energy production issues, because iron is needed as an ingredient to make the cake. And so we were talking about neurotransmitters. If dopamine is that nice cake, the nice gluten-free cake that I want to make, and I forget to put the eggs in that cake mix, and I throw that batter in the oven, the cake's not going to turn out right. Okay, and iron is one of those main ingredients that makes that cake turn out right. And so if somebody's got iron transport issues, they're going to have a lot of things that just are not going to function properly in the body. And so and like you mentioned about, I couldn't imagine not knowing someone's genetic, predisposition at some level, because it gives us insight in how somebody's biochemistry works. And so we're talking about iron. It's how does somebody's biochemistry and neurochemistry work? And iron is one of those main ingredients that allows the biochemistry to feel properly. So I couldn't imagine not knowing some of these genetic components. And it's really become a state when we talk about kind of our pyramid aspect that we use, is everybody that I sit down with, or everybody I consult with, it's like they have a histamine or an iron problem genetically until proven wrong, because they are that important. And the thing is if there's underlying issues with iron components that we're talking about here in terms of transport issues, nothing is going to have a lasting or a potent effect if you don't address that first. Because it's like you don't have the proper ingredients to make the cake. So it's not like, hey, I'm just going to maybe decorate the cake with some colorful icing and everything else and fool everybody. Well, hey, one bite of that cake, people are going to know that it's not a good cake. All right. So iron is so vital. And so everybody's got these iron issues, especially if I have labs and those labs are not optimal. It's like I am digging deep to figure out, all right, where are there possible genetic issues in terms of iron utilization? And if we can optimize that, then now what happens is we're able to use that essential element more effectively, and now that cake turns out right, and now we can get to work fixing the gut, or we can get to work, optimizing methylation with B vitamins, or working further up the hierarchy, in terms of like, okay, now are we doing like pure neurotransmitter support? Because if you don't address certain foundational things, and iron regulation being one of them, nothing else is going to stick. Nothing else is going to actually have a lasting or kind of stable change going forward. There's always going to be these relapses because you're missing something.
Yeah, and I think that should have a lot of light bulbs going off for people that never had that on their radar, John, because it doesn't fit into one little corner of it has to be this symptom or that symptom. It always comes down to where is that domino effect causing the break in the chain, right? And if that break in the chain is 3 links down, it still started with being pulled on from the iron problem. And so maybe talk about why it's important to get those overflowing buckets to clear out first before you go up into the less prioritized parts of the pyramid. So to maybe talk about that. So in terms of, okay, now that I realize that this is a problem for me, even though it wasn't on my radar before and I had no idea it was related to my insomnia, or I had no idea it was related to my anxiety, or whatever you may want to call it, why don't I just go and take, the supplements or the medications for that, and versus starting with causing, what do we do about these overflowing iron buckets or these problems? Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing is, sometimes and that's sometimes even a problem, because sometimes you can work up further up the pyramid or hierarchy when you're looking at genetics, and, take the MTHFR. Sometimes people can just start taking methylfolate and they feel better. But at a cellular level, from a biochemistry level, it's like there's still a big missing piece. And what eventually happens is that does catch up with them, because we talk about there's priorities. There's these deal breakers that we've talked about over and over again that are at the bottom of that kind of pyramid hierarchy. And what we've seen over the years is that if there's issues there, eventually, if you're just taking methylfolate, or if you're just taking, amino acids for neurotransmitters, or these herbals for neurotransmitter for brain function, eventually what happens is that inflammation cascade that's going on eventually is going to catch up with you. It could be weeks, could be months, could be a year, and it could reflect in some other type of symptom, because it almost gets into the whole thing of you're just putting a Band-Aid on the problem. All right, it's like, hey, my dopamine, I've got issues with focus, and I'm going to take this process or this supplement that helps dopamine regulation, or this product that helps acetylcholine. So now my focus is more tuned in, and that may help, but it could be masking a bigger foundational problem that may manifest in a year from now or 3 years from now as an autoimmune process, or as something like cancer development, things of that nature, because that bottom row of the pyramid that are these foundational things were not being addressed properly. And eventually that stuff catches up with you, because everything goes back to inflammation at some level. And that iron story, that iron bucket overflow story is one of the biggest things that can just add lighter fluid to a fire on an everyday basis.
Yeah, so to sum up, basically it starts with understanding the genetic component, which we talk about, right? And not being able to look at that, how the iron story, even if it appears to be a deficiency, it may be a deficiency in the blood, but it's maybe an excess in the GI tract, or an excess in other places. But ultimately, wherever there is an iron dysregulation, there's going to be the chance for these inflammatory free radicals that genetically don't get quenched properly, and then the weak link in the chain can be wherever that person's weak link in the chain is. So obviously, I'm sure a lot of the people that I assess too, John, they don't have any iron blood work. They don't have ferritin blood work. They don't have, so starting with a proper blood test, obviously, and understanding the ranges, maybe just go over those ranges again in terms of what you like to see ferritin and what you like to see serum iron.
Yeah, and the thing, like you mentioned, is like, not having the complete thing, where like a lot of times now people understand, like from a thyroid standpoint, there's a lot of information out there. It's like, oh, I've got to do a full thyroid panel. It's like, you really got to do a full iron panel as well. You want to look at a CBC that looks at your red blood cell markers, your hemoglobin hematocrit. You want to look at, serum iron saturation levels. You want to look at ferritin levels. And then a lot of times, if those are markers that are maybe abnormal, or you got a history of that, there's some advanced markers that you can look at as well to look at other issues where iron can drive, like, chronic inflammation aspects. But, serum iron and ferritin, at a minimum are the two things, look at. And those sweet spots that we look at with the serum iron, between 70 and 100, 75 to 95 really is optimal. And then ferritin, usually between 60 and 80. If it starts creeping, close to 100, and a lot of it's, what's happening to the serum iron levels as well. But then the thing is if we have one of those iron markers that's not in that sweet spot, then we want to do is say, all right, this serum iron level is low. It's 40. Okay, there's not enough gas in the tank. Then you go look at some of these genetic issues that don't transport, and all of a sudden somebody does have an SLC40A1 genetic variant, which means that they have a decreased ability to make enough ferroportin transport iron from the gut to the bloodstream. Right there, light bulb goes off. Hey, their iron levels are low, probably because it's all in the gut. And so it's just kind of being a detective and kind of connecting the dots on that aspect. And so a lot of times people, they're going to their doctors and they're just looking at a ferritin level. And here's the thing, here's one of my biggest pet peeves. If somebody goes and get their ferritin levels checked and their ferritin levels are 20, right? And they say, oh, you're anemic, and they give them iron. And all of a sudden it's like, all right, they come to me because they're feeling worse. And it's like, I run a serum iron level and their serum iron levels are 180. Even though their ferritin levels are low. Well, there's genetic factors of why people can't put iron in the storage. So all they're doing is they're taking iron that's actually able to transport across the guts, but can't get from the blood serum into the cell. And then some of that excess can't get stored. And all they're doing is they're raising their serum iron levels. And now there's a whole bunch of iron outside the cell not going to get in. And guess what that excess iron does? It's going to be lighter fluid on a fire every time. So all they're doing, because trying to get those ferritin levels up, by not looking at the whole story, they're actually just taking iron that's actually creating more inflammation on the body. So just like when we kind of have this understanding of like, oh, you got to look at a full thyroid panel of the whole story. If you've got chronic health issues, if you've got mood issues, if you've got, headaches, if you've got fatigue issues, you really, really, really want to look at, more than just one of those iron markers. You want to look at the whole story. And if they're not in those sweet spots, if your serum iron isn't, between that 70 to 100 range or 70 to 90 range, and your ferritin is not between 60 and 80, you probably want to definitely kind of take a step back and say, okay, now here's these genetic factors. Here's these SLC40A1 genes. Here's these ACO1 genes that deal with Krebs cycle function. Here's these HMOX genes. Here's these HFE genes that deal with iron storage. There's a handful of iron-specific genes that could be big players into why those iron levels are not optimal. And you probably want to start off supporting that first before you consider just taking iron.
Yeah. I mean, it almost speaks to having to go back to the medical school systems and retrain, basic blood evaluation, because it's huge problems. But the other thing I was going to say too is that you can also see the high red blood cells, the hemoglobin, the hematocrit, which also is going to create sort of that pseudo hypoxia where you're not getting good tissue perfusion, and now you're not making ATP. And a lot of these genetic types require ATP as a cofactor. And now you're really seeing sort of that snowball effect of overstimulation or having hormones and all the above. So,
and that even goes back into methylation aspects when you talk about MTHFR, and here's the thing is if somebody's, hey, I got an MTHFR defect, I just got to take a bunch of methylfolate, but that methylfolate goes in the methionine cycle, and your MAT gene, which is the last gene that's there to make SAMe, which is really one of the whole reasons of taking methylfolate in the first place is to SAMe production, that MAT gene is dependent on ATP. And so if you've got iron issues and you can't make enough ATP from a Krebs cycle or cellular level, then guess what? You can take all the methylfolate you want in the world. Eventually that's going to catch up with you, and your methylation process is going to dampen down because of the lack of ATP production.
And not only that, John, just to be a super nerd on top of your nerdiness and a loving is the fact that hydrogen peroxide also slows down that, MAT gene too.
Yep. Yep.
So it's amazing. And the hydrogen peroxide would be elevated with iron problems. So, it's amazing how I've kind of thought about the ingenuity of the body where it's self-protective in terms of that cell danger response. When things aren't working, it's built into the mechanics to slow things down on purpose.
Right.
But the good news is that when things are working, it's built into the mechanics to work better, so there's always hope, because it almost sounds like the sky's falling when we talk about all this information about, oh my gosh, it's doom and gloom. But, at the same time, for all the things that we see going wrong, the same reasons that they could be going right. So
right.
As far as any recommendation in terms of supplements that they may be looking at, provided that we've identified issues with iron metabolism in the GI tract, how that impacts pancreatic function, energy production, what would be sort of, I don't know your genetic type, I haven't really seen your gene SNPs, but here's a pretty good way of going about it depending on what we see.
Yeah, and this is one of those kind of delicate kind of answers, because like with certain things, like we talked last week about histamine, and that's something where, if somebody's got, maybe histamine intolerant symptoms, even without knowing the genetic story, they can consider taking DAO enzymes to see, okay, is that a piece of the puzzle from a histamine breakdown, in the gut. With iron, you really need to know the whole story before you start supplementing. Here's the thing, is that you got to know from a standpoint of like, okay, here's what my iron levels are. Here's what my ferritin levels are. Now here's the genetic component to that, okay? Because the thing is when you're talking about speeding up or slowing down, or like really, you said the body really has this, kind of innate intelligence to kind of really regulate things, adequately. Let's say the buildup of iron is in the gut, but we just kind of guess and we say, oh, okay, that's most likely the problem, and we take certain enzymes or certain components that help absorb the iron. But let's say that's not the problem; it's another piece of the component. You're going to probably maybe start doing more harm than good and start fueling that fire. So, this is kind of a topic I don't want to go into and really talk about too much about kind of support aspects, because this is something, if somebody's got a lot going on and they got a lot of inflammation and their glutathione levels are depleted and they've got excess iron, I don't want anybody kind of testing this component. Now, if they understand the genetic aspect, we can do some follow-up, Facebook Lives, or, in the things we're putting together from the course standpoint, was really going to kind of go through that and talk more in depth about, hey, if you've got this genetic component and your iron levels look like this, then this is what you should do. So we've kind of got it, tiered out there. But I think somebody really needs to know that information before they start supplementing on that iron story. And this is from experience, said, hey, it sounds like this. And you kind of give somebody, things from that standpoint. And it's like within 3 days, they are basically 10 times worse. And I've had patients with chronic Lyme and things of that nature where we didn't have the genetics back and we kind of took a guess. And literally they have, taken 3 or 4 steps backwards, and we're kind of now pulling them back out. So iron's one of those things, as much as it can drive inflammation, you really, really need to know the genetic story if you have those iron levels that are in that sweet spot. So you can start out by, hey, getting your iron levels checked. It's something that, you can get iron panels, through online sources for less than $50 that measure all that stuff and figure out, okay, if I've got chronic issues and my doctor's only checked ferritin levels or my doctor's only ran a CBC on me and it's been fine, maybe take that next step, check the rest of the story from an iron, see if that serum iron and ferritin are in those sweet spots. And if they are, then hey, you go to the next piece of the puzzle. But if they're not, then you really, really, really want to assess the genetic aspect and then delve into some of the information we're putting together and have put together that's going to be through your genetic type here very shortly. That's going to really kind of show you saying, all right, there's a basis, almost like a chart, like, hey, if your levels are low and you have these genes, this is what you got to do. If your levels are high and you got these genes, this is what you need to do. And that'll start getting those levels balanced out so that you're taking care of that piece of the puzzle and can move on to the next.
Yeah, no, it's a great answer, John. And I think also too, not only just providing the tools to understand what your genetic type, lots of free tools of figuring out what your genetic type is, so what your tendencies will be, and then of course putting together the genetic type unlocked course. And then from there, even having more hands-on work with us where we go through case studies, show how it turned out, what the test looked like, how to get the test. I mean, just to be able to provide the tools for people that are listening on how to work this yourself, because we know that you've been suffering for a long time and there's certain little things that you're missing out on. And I would say at the same time, you're really close too. Like there's a lot of things you're doing right, but if you're not understanding this huge topic we're talking about today, and you've always thought of it as, I've always been told I have low iron and I gotta continue to take iron supplementations, even though it wrecks my GI tract, or I was never told that I have high iron and I should do things to lower my iron. And I don't even know how genetics are related to all of this and how the domino effect impacts my anxiety and my insomnia. There's a lot of things you're missing that we want to put together for you. So we'll have that real soon at some point here, right?
Yeah, actually, my goal is actually Tuesday to wrap everything. I think we got to do on our end over this long weekend, and then that way we're ready to launch. So.
Okay, perfect. All right. And any other little words of wisdom, John?
No, I said the biggest thing that, if somebody can take from this is if they have ever been told, or they got a family history of iron issues, or they've been told they're anemic, is take that next step and look at the whole iron story, and then from there assess the genetic components. Because what I've seen in my practice with my patients, that if this iron story is an issue and you start addressing it, a lot of things start taking care of itself. You decreasing the buildup of iron in the gut. Guess what? The gut starts feeling better. You start utilizing iron more effectively. Energy goes up, mood goes up. So this is something that if it's a problem, it can start benefiting a lot of the symptoms that somebody suffers with on a chronic basis, because it starts kind of getting our biochemistry to fuel at a more optimized level. And so the biggest thing is investigate that a little bit deeper by doing more than just the 1 or 2 markers that are typically done. Investigate the whole story, and if they're not optimal, then look at the genetic component, find out how your genetic type can play into iron fuel and inflammation. And with that, it's going to be a foundational and more often than not a significant piece of the puzzle.
No, absolutely. And I mean, if you think about what we talked about on our previous podcast or video where we talked about histamine and the role that plays with leaky gut and reactivity and GI issues, I think with these 2 major topics alone, if you were to really get some insights and some real takeaways and apply that to what you're already doing, you can really see some huge improvements and huge changes. Yeah. So, all right. Well, this has been a good video. I don't have our topic for next week, John. So I'm sorry I didn't come prepared today.
That's all right.
But I'll do something. And, like I said, check us out on yourgenetictype.com. That will be launching our goal is for next Tuesday for our next Facebook Live. Our YouTube channel is Your Genetic Type as well. And you can follow us on Facebook if you're watching this now, on Instagram, Your Genetic Type. And please make sure you ask questions. If you have ideas for topics that you want us to talk about, We can't see the live comments in this Zoom application, but make sure you put them in there. We'll go back and answer your questions, and all the testing will be available as well. And then, of course, the course to be able to teach you how to manage it on your own will be available, and even some of the formulations and supplements too that will be awesome as well. So lots coming your way, and I hope you guys got a lot out of today. So we'll see you next time.
See you everybody next time.
All right.